I guess to start with, my topic of this presentation is slightly different to what was prescribed. It's not so much looking at a life cycle analysis in terms of the results, but the talk is more aimed at a project that I've been working on, which has been largely funded through the Sustainable Farming Fund via MAF, but also some industry co-contribution within there. And that project looked to develop some tools to enable both forest owners and also primary wood processors to collate and collect data and then analyse that data to be able to produce their own results relating to the carbon footprint. So the tools that have been developed have been called FPM, and that's basically just an acronym for Forest Products, Energy and Environmental Emissions Management. So as I said, and to make it clear, what we've done is develop two modelling tools, one for forest owners and one for primary wood processors to capture data relating to, capturing data across the supply chain related to inputs relevant to calculating a carbon footprint, and then that information is then actually modelled in the tool, and the result would be that either forest owner or primary wood processor would be armed with information relating to their carbon emissions across their supply chain, both at an absolute level but also at a product level in terms of the embodied carbon emissions in producing a given unit of product. The two tools have been developed applying life cycle analysis principles, which essentially breaks the supply chain down into its individual components and then looks to collect input data for each of those components within the supply chain and then analyses it in the context of carbon emissions. And there's a number of, standards that look across life cycle analysis, and the main ones are the PAS 2050, and I've got there a reference of 2008, but as of last weekend a new release of that has just come out, the PAS 2050 2011. There's also an ISO standard in development, ISO 14067, relating to carbon footprinting of products, and in my understanding that's sort of nearing the end of its development phase. And there's also World Research Institute Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard around carbon footprinting of products as well. So as I said, there's been two tools that have been developed. The first is called FPM Forestry, and what it does is it breaks down the supply chain into its individual components and then requires users to enter data relating to each of those activities. So the activities or processes within the forestry supply chain that the tool captures data for or is required to capture data for is office or management, so that's basically fleet vehicles and things like that. All operations relating to establishment, so land preparation as well as fertiliser, both pre and plant applications, silviculture, roading operations, harvesting, central processing where applicable, transport to both domestic and export markets. So just to give you, a look or feel as to what the forestry tool looks like, and zooming in on some of the parameters that are required to be entered for the harvesting component of the supply chain. What we have here is essentially the ability to model the fuel use by each crew operating within a particular harvesting environment or company environment. So what it requires the user to do is to basically enter or create crews into the tool, and then when a crew is created, then some metrics relating to that crew are added, and a machine inventory for that crew is also added. And basically what that is doing is capturing the required information to be able to model what the embodied CO2 emissions are for that component of the supply chain. And then basically that same logic follows through the other processes, and the result of which is that the outputs from the tool provide the user information relating to their absolute carbon emissions across the supply chain, so the total emissions emitted in delivering a given unit of product over a given period of time. And it also provides the ability for that user to analyse their informations on a per unit of product produced, so in this case either a per tonne or a per cubic metre of roundwood, and also the embodied emissions in harvesting a given hectare of forest, and that's the embodied emissions across all of the components of the supply chain. So that's essentially the forestry tool. And as I said previously, there's been a separate tool developed called FPM SAWMILL, and it holds the same logic as the forestry tool, where it looks to break the supply chain up into discrete components and then looks to collect data for each of those processes. But what the SAWMILL tool does, or is quite different to the forestry tool, is that it integrates with existing product and sales information systems that a mill is operating. And essentially what that enables the user to do is that it can define the processes across that supply chain, but also within its sawmill, and then it enables them to allocate inputs to each of those processes, and underlying those inputs are emission factors to help generate the actual carbon footprint information. But through bringing in the sales and production information from their existing systems, it enables the mass, which is basically the fibre flow throughout the mill, to be mapped through each of those processes, and what it enables is a mass balance to be essentially automatically calculated throughout the mill, and it knows what inputs go into what process, and then it knows how much volume is passed through each process. So from that data that's captured and analysed in the tool, again, we can get information relating to emissions, or absolute emissions generated across the supply chain, but also analyse that information on a per unit of product output basis. So I guess just some conclusions from the work that's been done and the tools that have been developed is that carbon footprinting and life cycle assessment is an emerging metric with an increasing emphasis largely driven by retailers. It does have a potential to become a barrier to entry in certain markets, much like FSC has become in, again, certain markets. But I guess looking beyond carbon, there are other environmental metrics that are also coming into focus, particularly relating to water and land use, which have, I guess, significant relevance to the forestry and wood product sector. But I guess the final conclusion is really that New Zealand's wood and forest sector has the capability and capacity now to meet future demands to deliver this information through the tools that have been developed. And the tools are now available. That the forestry tool is a web-based tool. There's a URL set up which can be accessed to gain access to that tool. The URL is forestry.fpm.org.nz. And the sawmilling tool is also available, but it's not currently available over a URL or over a website, but the access to the forestry tool can be arranged by contacting the email given there, which is office@woodco.org.nz. So that is the conclusion of my talk. Thanks very much.